This is the First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the First Century. Episode 48. Messalina and the Gardens of Lucullus. In 46, Asiaticus Valerius was appointed consul for the second time. We recall that he was the one whose wife was taken by Caligula at one of his famous imperial dinners. Asiaticus was not part of the conspiracy to assassinate Caligula, but in front of the Senate he said he wished he had been. He had even been considered by the Senate as Caligula's successor before Claudius was so named by the Praetorian Guard. Asiaticus had been one of those who accompanied Claudius on his invasion of Britannia, and recently he had purchased the Lucullus Gardens, named for the general Lucius Licinius Lucullus, on the Pincian Hill near what is today the Villa Borghese. Lucullus had led an army to Persia and was inspired by their gardens, aiming to replicate them in Rome. The gardens were home to a library, and they were even decorated with statues. They were known as the most splendid and opulent gardens in Rome. And unfortunately for Asiaticus, they attracted the attention of Messalina, who wanted to acquire them. To do so, Messalina thought it best to eliminate Asiaticus, so she accused him of an adulterous relationship with Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea had earlier been associated with the actor Nestor, whom Messalina desired for herself. Messalina removed Poppaea from the relationship and even secured Claudius's assistance in compelling Nestor to comply with her wishes, as we heard in episode 46. The allegation involving Poppaea was only one part of the case against Asiaticus. To strengthen the prosecution, Messalina enlisted the notorious informer Publius Sullius Rufus, who was already known for bringing accusations against prominent Romans, including that against Julia Livia, which we heard about in episode 41. Messalina also persuaded Eusebius, tutor to her son Britannicus, to warn Claudius that Asiaticus posed a political threat. Together, these charges helped bring about Asiaticus's condemnation. It happened like this. Eusebius went directly to Claudius to say that Asiaticus had been the principal instigator for Gaius's murder. He claimed that Asiaticus boasted of it at the time and was still famous for it. Moreover, Asiaticus, who was from Gaul, was intending to visit the legions in Germany, so it was likely that he could muster support from his home province and perhaps even engage in a coup. But in actuality, Asiaticus had not participated in the murder of Gaius, but he had been sitting next to the princeps in the theater on the day he was assassinated. Asiaticus freely admitted that he had not been part of the conspiracy, but would have had he known of it. Still, Eusebius's words to Claudius had the intended effect. The princeps immediately called Crispinus, commander of the guard, to arrest Asiaticus, who at the time was in Baiae, the famously luxurious Roman resort town on the Bay of Naples, popular with the elite for its hot springs and scandalous reputation for excess. Crispinus took a massive force with him to seize Asiaticus, bind him in chains, and hale him before Claudius and Messalina to defend himself against the charges that Rufus was ready to articulate. The senator Vitellius was also there as a witness. Rufus accused Asiaticus of corrupting the army and securing the soldiers' loyalty through bribes and favors, as well as of adultery with Poppaea Sabina. He then added the charge of, quote, unmanly vice, end quote, or in Latin, impudicitia. That charge implied that he had played the passive part in a homosexual relationship with some of those in the military. A Roman aristocrat was expected to be dominant rather than submissive, especially sexually, self-controlled rather than indulgent, capable of leadership, military command, and authority, and essentially masculine in appearance and behavior. So at this accusation, Asiaticus erupted, saying to Rufus, "Your own sons can confirm my manhood, because they experienced it firsthand," implying that he had dominated them sexually. Asiaticus's subsequent defense moved Claudius profoundly, and even drew tears from Messalina. Yet, as she left the room to compose herself, she warned Vitellius not to allow Asiaticus to escape conviction. When in the other room, Messalina quickly devised a plan against Poppaea Sabina. The empress sent a squad of soldiers to Poppaea Sabina to threaten her with imprisonment, telling her that Asiaticus was defending himself at that very moment before the emperor. The threats against Poppaea increased to the point of encouraging her to commit suicide. The soldiers told her that there was no escape from these charges, and she was already as good as dead. Poppaea quickly lost hope and took her own life, much to the chagrin of her husband, Publius Cornelius Lentulus Scipio, who had served as consul in 24 CE. Back in the emperor's quarters, Claudius had heard Asiaticus's defense, and he asked Vitellius for his advice. Vitellius was a shrewd politician and something of a sycophant. Plus, he had just received encouragement from Messalina to finish the case. So he began by recounting to Claudius their shared devotion to Antonia, Claudius's late mother. Then Vitellius shared stories of Asiaticus's service to the empire, including his noble performance in Britannia not long ago with Claudius himself. Given that, Vitellius argued, it was best for Asiaticus to choose his own manner of death. Claudius agreed, and with that he dismissed Asiaticus as guilty. Under the watchful eye of the guard, Asiaticus retired to his own gardens with some friends, who encouraged him to starve himself. But after his regular afternoon exercises, a bath, and dinner, Asiaticus chose instead to let his own blood. Just before he cut his veins, he told his friends that it would have been better to die under the wiles of Tiberius or the violence of Gaius, rather than the wiles of a woman, that is, Messalina, and the violent tongue of the two-faced Vitellius. With that, he slashed his wrists, and then noticed that the pyre, which had been set up for his corpse, was too close to one of his favorite trees. With life slipping away, Asiaticus had the foresight and thoughtfulness to have the pyre moved away from the tree. Even to the end, Asiaticus was noble and expressed care for his gardens. Messalina had kept the news of Poppaea Sabina's death from the princeps, and a few days later, Claudius invited Publius Cornelius Lentulus Scipio to dinner, and then he asked where his wife was. His guest could only apologize that his wife, Poppaea, could not be there because she had committed suicide. When the Senate came together, Rufus reported on the recent developments and recommended that Crispinus should receive a special stipend of 1.5 million sesterces for acting so quickly and effectively in the public interest. Vitellius recommended that Sosibius, Britannicus's tutor, be given 1 million sesterces for assisting Britannicus in giving such good and actionable advice to Claudius. Scipio, husband of the late Poppaea Sabina, was then called upon for his opinion. In an act of political prudence, rather than marital loyalty, he declared that he concurred with everything that's been said regarding his wife's misconduct, and he would therefore vote with the majority. In so doing, he displayed shrewd political instinct, distancing himself from an officially condemned spouse, while presenting himself as a loyal senator and obedient supporter of the regime. He essentially sacrificed any public defense of Poppaea in order to protect his own standing. Messalina had succeeded in destroying both Asiaticus and Poppaea Sabina, while rewarding the network of friends and allies who had helped carry out her designs. Claudius, meanwhile, seemed entirely unaware of the manipulation occurring around him. He didn't even know that Poppaea Sabina had committed suicide. Ever the scholar, he occupied himself with antiquarian pursuits, reflecting on how new letters had been added to the alphabet in earlier ages, and so now he considered what additions he himself might contribute. He was also preoccupied with preparations for the celebration of the secular games, which he had recently authorized. As the emperor immersed himself in such matters, senators increasingly whispered that Messalina's influence had become too dangerous. Yet few possessed either the courage or the means to challenge her. To oppose Messalina was, in effect, to challenge the princeps himself. Consequently, most chose silence and continued their acquiescence. Next time, we'll hear about Claudius's secular games and catch up with Paul and Barnabas in Galatia.